Great. Thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar on Utah universities and Iran. We are very fortunate to have a scholar who has done significant research on this topic, and I'm sure he will have some fascinating story about the connections of Utah universities with Iran. I want to welcome our participants from different universities in Utah who have signed up, and also want to thank our sponsors for sponsoring the Baskerville Institute lecture series. Our goal is to really inform both American public and Iranians about the history of friendship between Americans and Iranians. And we want to also emphasize how certain period in American relation history symbolizes that friendship. And today's talk by Professor Garlitz is one example of that friendship that engaged Utah universities, technicians, and Iran. So with that, I'll allow Matt, our research fellow, to introduce Professor Garlitz for today's talk.
Thank you very much, Bahman, and to everybody who supports the Baskerville Institute and is attending today. We're very grateful for you. And we're very grateful to Dr. Richard Garlitz for spending some time with us today. He is a professor of history at the University of Tennessee at Martin, and he has been thinking about international education, for many years now on various levels, leading international trips abroad as a professor at Martin, and for our purposes today, publishing extensively on the subject. Most importantly, I'll highlight two, and we'll turn it over to Ricky. He co-edited a book titled Teaching America to the World and the World to America, Education and Foreign Relations since 1870, and that was in 2012. And also, especially important for us today, A Mission for Development, Utah Universities and the Point 4 program in Iran, published in 2018. And you see it right there, very attractive cover that the press and Ricky pulled together there in paperback form, affordable wherever you can find scholarly books. Richard Garlitz, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you both to Bahman Bakhtiari and the Baskerville Institute for having me here today. I'd also like to thank Matthew Shannon and Delara Hosseini for helping to put this talk together. Matt also invited me to contribute a chapter on these projects, these Utah projects, to his outstanding volume, American-Iranian Dialogues, which Bloomsbury Academic published last year. And I think a number of other speakers here for the Baskerville Institute have contributed to this volume as well. It's an extremely well done book. I also want to thank everyone here for taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. Are the slides up? Are we going to do the share?
Yes.
Okay. Today, I'm going to talk about my recent book, A Mission for Development, Utah Universities and the Point 4 program in Iran. I've immediately regretted that title, the Point 4 program in Iran, because it's a little obscure. I really probably should have talked about Utah Universities and American Technical Assistance or something a little broader than that. If I could just start by saying a word or two about the book's origin story. Back in 2006, I was a PhD candidate just starting my dissertation research, and I was interested in the connection between American universities and international development during the early Cold War. I was actually originally going to focus on Turkey, because at that time, that was the country that interested me the most. One of my advisors at Ohio University, Dr. Shola Quinn, who is now at University of California, Merced, convinced me to broaden that research to also include projects in Iran. She said it would be easier to publish, and she was right. So I started reading about these Utah projects that were part of President Truman's Point 4 program. I made my first research trip to Utah in December 2006. There I met Jessie Embry, who's now retired from the Charles Redd Center for Western American Studies at BYU. She spent 2 years of her childhood in Iran, while her father, Bertus L. Embry, was a member of the USU field team in the early 1960s. Jessie shared with me her vast knowledge of the Utahns' experience in Iran. She also gave me transcripts of interviews she had conducted with many of the advisors and their spouses. These interviews, which are now part of the Utah Universities in Iran Oral History Project, or Oral History Collection in the BYU archives, added immeasurable value to this book. Now, 2 years later, the fall of 2008, I came to the University of Tennessee at Martin, where I've been teaching ever since. There, I met Richard Saunders, who is a longtime university archivist at UTM and is now at Southern Utah University. As it turns out, Richard Saunders is a grandson of Richard Welling Ross Kelly. Ross Kelly was a rural sociologist who led the first Utah State advisory group to Iran way back in the fall of 1951. Ross Kelly's meticulous documentation of his work in Iran, he was there from 1951 to 1953, and he kept very good records, as well as his extensive photograph collection, also greatly informed this book. And we'll look at a few of the photographs that are in the book, and you'll see that most of them come from the Richard Welling Ross Kelly photograph collection. Richard Saunders also helped me pitch this book project to Utah State University Press. So thank you to all of those people who helped bring this book to life. A Mission for Development tells the story of how Utah's 3 largest universities contributed to Iran's modernization during the early Cold War. Their work began with President Truman's Point 4 program in 1951, and it continued through the middle of the 1960s under the Agency for International Development, or USAID, that developed during the Kennedy years. Iran became the first country to receive American technical assistance during the Cold War and continued to host an American technical assistance mission for the next 16 years. Utah State University supported agricultural projects in Iran and maintained a continuous presence in that country from the fall of 1951 until 1964. Brigham Young University, BYU, sent 2 different teams of advisors to Iran. Both dealt with education. The first, from the fall of 1951 until the summer of 1955, addressed teacher training and some development of rural schools, including the early development of a program of portable tent schools for Iran's nomadic tribes. The second one dealt with the National Teachers Training College, which is part of the University of Tehran. That was from 1957, 1961. The University of Utah supported just a small team of rural public health professionals in Iran between the fall of 1951 and summer of 1956. The University of Utah group was the smallest and the shortest lived in Iran. The early Utah projects reflect Point 4's original emphasis on small-scale rural improvement. Their goal was to improve quality of life for ordinary Iranians without imposing significant social changes or relying on expensive technologies. Utah State University's early agricultural projects sought improvements in crop production, livestock health and breeding, irrigation methods, and improving grazing lands. USU advisors also assisted the Ministry of Agriculture in training extension agents who would diffuse information about scientific agriculture to Iranian farmers. BYU's first contract provided pedagogical training for Iranian teachers. And of course, the University of Utah focused primarily on public health and education in sanitation and hygiene. By the middle of the 1950s, university participation in American technical assistance had largely shifted to expanding and modernizing higher education. That was part of a consolidation and reorganization of the technical assistance program during the Eisenhower years. The Utah projects reflected this change in priorities in the middle of the 1950s. Utah State University and BYU both supported colleges of the University of Tehran, Carthage Agricultural College, and the National Teacher Training College. Again, with the primary focus being on these colleges in the latter years. Yes, go ahead and just share the PowerPoint, and I'll move them forward as need be. The Utahns approached their work with dedication and sincerity. They volunteered to go to Iran both out of a sense of patriotism and out of a sincere desire to do something beneficial for the Iranian people. They wholeheartedly believed their efforts would defeat international communism in Iran. They were very much in a Cold War mindset, especially during the chaotic years of 1951 through 1953, the oil nationalization crisis that culminated with the Anglo-American supported military coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh. Most of the Utahns were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were Mormons. Their shared religious faith helped them form a dedicated community and sustained them through the inevitable difficulties of living and working in a strange and remote foreign land. Some of these Utahns, through their connections with the LDS missions, did have some prior experience abroad. Despite their laudable intentions, the Utah projects enjoyed only limited success in Iran. And you can just go back to the title slide here for a moment. I'll let you know when to move them forward. We'll be getting to them in just a second. Only limited success in Iran, a reality that put these Utah projects on about the same plane as other American technical assistance projects around the world in the 50s and 60s. The Utahns brought an abundance of technical knowledge to Iran, but very limited understanding of the country itself. They faced a sharp learning curve from interactions with Iranians of all walks of life, from cabinet ministers down to village leaders and religious leaders and tribal khans, to navigating in a country where paved roads and clean water were still comparatively rare in many rural communities. Their experience served as a reminder that technical assistance is never just technical. It involves a complex web of cultural negotiations. Moreover, techniques that had worked well in the American context did not necessarily translate seamlessly to Iran. That was one of the reasons why the Utah universities were chosen in the first place, because of the development of the American West in the late 19th and early 20th century. Americans and Iranians also brought fundamentally different perspectives to technical assistance. Point Four's architects in the Truman administration envisioned a small-scale grassroots program that would emphasize training and demonstrations over big financial and material commitments. Iranian leaders, in contrast, wanted tangible evidence of modernization, machines, equipment, infrastructure, and the like. The emphasis on small-scale rural development, especially in the early 1950s, frustrated many Iranians. Projects designed to expand and modernize education from primary level up to universities likewise created frequent disagreements. Iranian partners often expressed appreciation for American material resources, but were much less enthusiastic about American influence on Iran's schools and universities, particularly the curriculum and pedagogical techniques. And of course, not surprisingly, the Utah State University and BYU advisors often found themselves in the middle of these controversies. A frustrating lack of coherence and stability within the U.S. technical assistance program negatively impacted some of the Utah projects. Again, particularly in the 1950s. Frequently shifting federal policies impaired the recruitment of advisors and the support they received in the field. Again, here I would just point out that in early 1953, there was a significant change in U.S. government from the Truman administration to the Eisenhower administration. That meant that executive power in the United States was changing political parties and bringing in some different philosophies and approaches to foreign aid. So there was never a very coherent strategy during the a cohesive strategy during the 1950s. Administrators at all three Utah universities complained about the level of cooperation they received from Washington, D.C. The most serious difference occurred in 1955 when the Eisenhower administration appointed former Congressman John Hollister of Ohio to take over and overhaul the technical assistance program. Hollister doubted the efficacy of university projects and terminated several of them. The University of Utah Public Health Initiative and BYU's first contract in Iran both ended during this period. The circumstances under which the BYU teacher training project in particular terminated caused a great deal of resentment in Utah and among the Utah community. Moreover, these discontinued projects had not yet achieved lasting results, which left many of the Utahns feeling as though their efforts had been wasted. Finally, in 1956, federal officials shifted administrative control of the agricultural projects from Point 4, which really meant from Utah State advisors, because they filled most of the leadership positions in the agricultural program, to the Iranian Ministry of Agriculture. The change was designed to integrate Point 4 projects better into Iran's development plans, while reducing American involvement to just advice and training, and especially reducing American financial commitments. Many of the Utahns applauded the change as a positive step for Iran's development. Nevertheless, it appears that many of these projects, many of the agricultural projects, floundered during the middle to late 1950s amid uncertainty over changes in responsibilities. Now, why Utah? The U.S. government looked to Utah for a couple of reasons. First, Franklin Harris was the first director of Point 4's Rural Improvement Program in Iran. He had vast connections within the state. Harris had served as president of both Brigham Young University and Utah State University. In fact, he was serving as president of Utah State University when he joined the Point 4 program in 1950. He was also a respected figure in the LDS Church. Harris had a working knowledge of Iranian agriculture. He had spent most of 1939 and 1940 in that country surveying agricultural problems for the Iranian government. Second, Utah State University also had pre-existing agricultural connections to Iran. Upon returning back to the United States in 1940, Harris recommended two Utahns, Don Pittman, an agronomist, and Luther Windsor, an irrigation engineer, to continue the work. So you can go ahead and go to the slide on this one, the Windsor. Luther Windsor stayed in Iran through 1946, working on irrigation problems for the Ministry of Agriculture, a position that gave him access to important Iranian government leaders, including the young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi himself. Here you can see some photos from the Luther Windsor paper collection in Utah State University archives. Windsor took a 3-day horseback trip with the young Shah to irrigation facilities around Tehran. USU agronomist George Stewart traveled to Iran in 1949, along with other American experts, to start laying practical plans for the country's agricultural development. So there were a number of Utah State folks who were already connected to Iran's agricultural development and agricultural problems in Iran. Harris pressed his Utah colleagues to participate in Point 4's new rural improvement initiative before it even began. He wrote to USU senior administrators that he was thoroughly convinced that Utah State University, or what was actually then Utah State Agricultural College, was better suited to this task than any other institution. He added that Utah and the college are known favorably throughout Iran, knows of no other institution that could carry out the work as well. Meanwhile, the State Department reached out to Brigham Young University. A State Department official contacted BYU officials in May of 1951. Once the duties were divided up and the contracts were all signed, Franklin Harris spent the summer of 1951 assembling the field team and preparing them for departure to Iran that fall. Now, none of these Utahns had much familiarity with Iran before 1951. In fact, several of them acknowledged having difficulty finding the country on a map. Preparing entire families to move overseas for 2 years, and Point 4 assignments were typically 2 years in duration, was a daunting task that required extensive planning. The Utah families did not know where they would be stationed, at least the original ones, because the program was still taking shape as they were preparing to go. They didn't know where they'd be stationed or what amenities might be available. Comfortable homes were generally available in Tehran and in the major cities, although the amenities were not as modern. The stoves, heating was not as modern, and they did have to purify drinking water daily. But living conditions in the provinces, in the smaller communities where many of the agricultural people would be working, could be much more primitive. The Utah families in Tehran lived close together, both out of a sense of community and for protection. And if you could go ahead and go to the next slide here, we'll see, here you can see a gathering of an LDS church gathering in Tehran in 1954. With many of that first generation, that first group of Utah State and BYU advisors. And so the church, the common faith, I think, gave them a grounding and helped sustain them through difficult times. Of course, families stationed outside of Tehran would have much less contact with this group. There was an American school in Tehran, but families stationed in the provinces often had to make do on their own. So many of the families brought their own schooling materials, and mothers often conducted the classes themselves. The first families to leave for Iran from Utah State and BYU received only a short 2-week training in Washington, D.C. before departure. None of them could speak Persian. All of the Utahns experienced some level of culture shock. One of my favorite quotations, or actually one of my favorite letters, really, from this entire research was one of the BYU professors, A. Reed Morrill, wrote to BYU President Ernest Wilkinson about his initial impressions of Iran upon arriving in the fall of 1953. And Morrill writes, "This is indeed a strange land into which we have flown, strange in custom, strange in human action, and degenerate in appearance." And so again, I suppose there's probably some American, Orientalist stereotypes about the exotic East wrapped up in some of these initial impressions. It was a shock for many of the Utahns to see camels and donkeys in the streets, observing Iranian agriculture, conjured up images of ancient Israel for several of the advisors. Helen Milligan, wife of Cleve Milligan, one of the first Utah State, in the first Utah State group, said it was like being transported back to biblical times to see the way they did things. Several of the Utahns commented on the stark disparities between wealth and poverty in Tehran and other Iranian cities. and if you would go to the next slide here, we'll take a look at another photo. But the challenge of living and working in Iran also heightened the sense of also heightened the sense of adventure, I think, for many of the Utahns. And here you can see a group of the very first Utah State advisors, Hendrik Verse Luis, Cleve Milligan, J. Clark Ballard, Richard Welling Roskillian, and Dean Peterson on a hillside north of Tehran in the spring of 1952. Some of the Utah families even used the occasion to travel through the Middle East. A number of them went to archaeological sites in Syria, in Iraq, and Egypt on their way to or from the assignments. Some families did experience brushes with danger while they were in Utah. At least 3 reported being victims of robberies at some point. Several of the Utahns witnessed disturbances during the oil nationalization crisis from 1951 to 1953. As anti-British rhetoric increased in Iran throughout 1952, several of the Utahns talked about deliberately making themselves as inconspicuous as possible. They did not want to be confused with the British. Now, Utah State University irrigation specialist Cleve Milligan, who's actually is second from the left in this photo. Milligan was one of the neatest people that I studied here. His response to this whole thing was kind of priceless. He dismissed the disturbances in 1952 as quite harmless, and in his view, more people get hurt in a Stanford, California football rivalry. I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway, in 1952, Cleve Milligan didn't think that there was too much danger, but the violence got worse. In July of 1952, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll look at another photo. In July of 1952, the Point 4 offices in Shiraz were vandalized following the nationwide demonstrations in favor of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, I don't think that that's what this photograph is showing, but this is a photograph showing the demonstrations becoming more ominous in the summer of 1952. Mob violence gripped the city of Tehran at the end of February in 1953, as the Shah and his wife prepared to leave the country ostensibly for vacation, but in reality to seek some medical treatment. Anti-Mossadegh crowds crashed through the prime minister's front gate. Mossadegh himself was forced to flee his own home into an adjacent Point 4 compound that actually shared a wall with the prime minister's residence. Just as USU agronomist Roy Bunnell and BYU advisor Max Variesa arrived on the scene. According to Bunnell, the prime minister flagged down the pair who took Mossadegh into their car and, in their words, drove him out of the grasp of rioters. So again, the point, the Utahns did find themselves in the midst of these controversies developing in Iran from 1951 to 1953. Finally, if we go to the next slide, mobs ransacked and destroyed the Point 4 offices in Tehran during the climax of the anti-Mossadegh coup on August 19th. 1953, and here you can see some cars that had been destroyed. A soldier actually stationed in the ruined office buildings of the Point 4 group, including the Utahns, were using in Iran. Now, for the projects themselves, Utah State University had 14 agricultural advisors in the country, in Iran, by the end of 1952. All of them held some form of leadership position within Point 4's agricultural division. the Utah State University contingent was actually quite important to these early agricultural projects. According to Roy Bunnell, the first task was to establish credibility with farmers and village leaders. Progress, he explained, was measured first by attitudes, then by confidence, then trials and observation, further trials, and eventually by introducing new practices. So it was a slow-going road. The Utah State scientists' early efforts yielded mixed results. Initial research emphasized the development of higher yield cereal crops that would be more resistant to drought and insects. Keep in mind, grains accounted for about 95% of land under cultivation in Iran in the middle of the 20th century. Iran's varied climate and topography both complicated that work, so there was a lot of scientific information for the Utahns to digest. In some cases, the Utahns' lack of familiarity with local customs, and particularly their lack of familiarity with water rights, undermined promising starts. The USU advisors learned a great deal from these early failures, but as you might imagine, they did not inspire a great deal of confidence among rural leaders in Iran. Projects designed to improve livestock breeding also required time and modification to produce consistently good results. Point 4 introduced lots of new livestock into Iran in the early 1950s. New breeds of bulls, donkeys, chickens. Many of these succumbed to local diseases. The donkeys in particular inspired a great deal of mockery from skeptical Iranians, particularly those on the left. You know, the great Americans show up to help Iran, and what do they bring? A bunch of donkeys. Crossbreeding helped improve dairy production by the end of the 1950s, however, and Utah scientists did help the Tehran veterinary department vaccinate around 11 million farm animals between 1952 and 1956. So they were starting to show some success. It is important to note, though, that the success of these early agricultural projects were mostly localized. They had some impact on the area in which they operated, but not especially nationwide. Creating a modern agricultural extension service that could disseminate better techniques to Iranian farmers was a major priority for the Iranian government. Training extension agents fit naturally into Point 4's low modernization approach and was probably the most successful Utah State University contribution to Iran's agriculture. With Point 4 help, the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Mustafa Zahidi, began organizing training seminars for Iranian extension agents in the summer of 1952. And if you want to go to the next slide, we can look at some extension agents in the field. Rural sociologist Richard Welling Roskelley. Roskelley is third from left in this photo. Emphasized teaching extension agents to engage villagers on terms that they could understand in ways that would allow them to see how better techniques could improve quality of life. The USU advisors also helped the Iranian Ministry of Agriculture organize things like county fairs and field days to demonstrate new techniques in crop production and livestock. Now, engineering work. Engineering work for the Point 4 Agricultural Division concentrated on irrigation and mechanization, two areas that really stretched the limits of low modernization. Of those two, irrigation was the most important. Few Iranian agricultural officials had been really trained in water management before the 1950s. The Iranian government had limited reliable information on groundwater supplies and irrigation usage throughout much of the country. Due to the limits of Iran's infrastructure, irrigation tended to focus on simple techniques like leveling and corrugating fields to conserve and maximize water usage. Both Cleve Milligan and Bruce Anderson and his family spent, I think, something like 7 years in Iran over a couple of different contracts. They also designed a series of demonstration courses to help Iranian farmers maximize the water that was available. Now, Iranian officials were drawn towards agricultural mechanization because large equipment promoted the appearance of modernization. But in this case, it's interesting. Mechanized agriculture often created more problems than solutions. For one thing, Point 4's modest budget included funds for only a handful of scattered machinery demonstrations, the utility of which were pretty questionable, given how few Iranian farmers could afford large equipment. The country's underdeveloped infrastructure left many areas inaccessible to large equipment. And small farmers often worked plots that were too small for that kind of equipment anyway. Iran lacked trained mechanics and suppliers of spare parts. Poorly trained operators and mechanics often did more harm to machines than good. Parts ordered abroad were expensive and caused lengthy delays. Fuel supply and distribution were also challenging problems in Iran, despite the country's status as a burgeoning petroleum producer. Bruce Anderson reported that in 1954, every region of the country was plagued with machinery problems. And he noted several cases in which large landowners often sold machines in order to buy more livestock, for which the farmers were better acquainted. Nor did Iran's small farmers necessarily embrace mechanized agriculture, even though it might greatly reduce their workloads. Farmers who owned their own oxen, farmers who owned their own draft animals, for example, risked losing a portion of their harvest and sliding further into debt if they had to rent more expensive equipment instead. Machines also increased efficiency, which threatened to deprive the poorest families of the traditional gleaning that took place after the harvest was finished. And that gleaning could account for as much as a month to 6 weeks worth of bread. Smaller horticultural equipment, such as garden planters, ox-pulled cultivators, proved much more successful and did help to increase the amount of land under vegetable cultivation. Now, if you go to the next slide, we'll look at this. Next slide. Now here, these are two of my favorite photographs from the book. And as it turns out, these photographs were, they appear together on pages 90 and 91. And I didn't plan it, it just worked out that way. But if you look at the photo on the right, this was really the purpose of Point 4. Here you have one lone advisor in a rural setting without, a lot of equipment and machines, just him and the village kids inspecting an irrigation well. Not a lot of fanfare, not a lot of equipment. It's just him. But the photograph on the left, you see a demonstration of a harvester. And here you have the government officials, military, individuals in business suits. This one attracts a lot of attention. But it was the photo on the right that was really the original, and it was closer to the original intention of Point 4. Many Iranian officials found Point 4's rural improvement initiative underwhelming, especially prior to the massive expansion of American development aid to Iran that happened in 1954, that happened after the coup that got rid of Mossadegh. They tended to favor large-scale modernization that would enhance Iran's prestige. William Warren, and Warren was the guy who first led the Point 4 program in Iran. He was first director of Point 4's operations in Iran. Warren felt that many of the Iranian leaders had unrealistic expectations of what the program could accomplish. And it is true, the Utah State agricultural projects proved modest when stacked up against the country's agricultural needs. Now, the University of Utah contributed to the public health dimension of rural improvement between 1951 and 1956. The University of Utah team was the smallest of the three. It also encountered the most significant difficulties. Point 4 needed doctors and nurses who were willing to relocate to remote parts of Iran and work on diseases that were really no longer common in the United States. And if you go to the next slide, you can see some of the public health initiative in action. In addition, the University of Utah advisors did encounter great personal difficulties. One family lost a young baby that was born prematurely in Iran and died within months. One of the University of Utah nurses died tragically in a plane crash outside of Tehran on Christmas Day, 1952. And again, remember, there weren't that many from the University of Utah. So to have two great tragedies like that, I think undercut morale. The other thing I would say is I don't know really that the University of Utah was really as committed to this as Utah State and BYU were. I think to the University of Utah, this was just another international opportunity among many. BYU's first contract in Iran also supported rural improvement. The BYU professors worked on 2 initiatives to provide professional training for Iranian teachers and helping to organize a program of mobile tent schools for the country's tribal nomads. Rural elementary school teachers in Iran often had as little as 6 years of formal education in the 1950s, and really the country was really just first starting to see teaching, particularly in the lower grades, as a profession in the early 1950s, and as a profession that would contribute to national development. And that's really what the BYU folks were trying to do, was professionalize teacher training, professionalize what they were doing in the classroom to enhance national development. Their summer training courses did reach about 6,000 teachers in Iran by the middle of 1955. While these courses eventually drew some praise from Iranians, they got off to a little bit of a rocky start, but eventually some of the Iranian partners came around to seeing value in them. They ended abruptly in the summer of 1955 when the US government terminated that BYU contract. BYU also provided one advisor, a guy named Glenn Gagin, who assisted Mohammed Bahmanbegi in an early plan to develop tent schools for tribal nomads, particularly the Qashqai tribe. Point 4's role, BYU's role in that was really very limited to just collecting data and organizing supplies, and that entire tent school initiative was disrupted by the disturbances in 1953, as a lot of the Qashqai Khans were supporters of Mossadegh. By the middle of the 1950s, the projects switched to higher education, and again, that was a change in priorities within the U.S. government. Utah advisors brought 2 main priorities to Iranian higher education. One was pedagogical reforms, introducing more hands-on instruction, practical applications of knowledge. And the other one was trying to introduce new fields of study into Iranian universities that would be important for economic development, fields like home economics, elementary education, physical education. Both Iranians and American development planners wanted to expand access to universities to meet a rising expectation among young Iranians and thereby reduce the number of Iranians who sought higher education abroad. Utah State University collaborated with Karaj Agricultural College, the Agricultural College of the University of Tehran, located about 30 miles outside of Tehran in the town of Karaj. BYU sent another team from 1957 to 1961 that collaborated with the Teacher Training College of the University of Tehran. It's interesting that home economics, really the idea of training home economists, both to improve quality of life in rural communities and also to enhance educational and professional opportunities for Iranian women, that was a high priority in both projects. The agricultural college showed an interest in home economics and even hired a faculty member to start developing a program, but inadequate housing for female students and lack of classroom space really kind of stagnated that development. Home economics fared quite a bit better at the teacher training college, where two young women, both of whom had formerly been Point 4 extension agents, and one of whom was a graduate of Utah State University, developed a successful home economics program at the teacher training college. One of the big priorities, particularly at Carthage, the agricultural college, was to get agricultural students to engage in farm work. The idea of farmers or professionals engaging in manual labor was something that was very difficult to convince these students that was a good thing. The USU advisors did help develop a 500-acre research and teaching farm at Carthage. By 1961, the farm included a machinery shed, 4 deep wells, modern irrigation pumps. Again, it was hard to convince the college students that they should get their hands dirty, actually learning how to do agricultural work. But the USU technicians did report that the ones who did embrace those skills found themselves in quite high demand upon graduation. The Utah State advisors also tried to convince the Iranian government to open up more spaces in the college for graduates of agricultural high schools. Many of the American pedagogical reforms either met with resistance, or Iranian academic leaders just sort of adapted them to fit their purpose. Richard Welling Ross Kelly, here's a quote that I like, said that the faculty at Carthage Agricultural College were very secure in their curriculum and their teaching methods, and were very resistant to making any changes. So they were quite similar, I think, some of the colleagues I know here in Tennessee. He added that the Iranians were appreciative of the money and the resources that Americans brought, but were not really interested in American advice on teaching and curriculum. Iran's, the administrators at the agricultural college seemed to tell about the same story as well. The longtime dean there, Mohammed Hassan Madavi, concluded that the only reason that the Iranian professors put up with the Americans is they brought so much money with them. So, and the BYU advisors encountered similar problems at the teacher training colleges as well. Appreciation for American resources, not a lot of enthusiasm for pedagogical and curricular advice coming from these Americans. The Utah experiences at Carthage Agricultural College and the Teacher Training College in Tehran illustrate that Iranians were far from passive recipients of American technical aid. Iranian professors and administrators wanted American material assistance, but they tried to limit American pedagogical and curricular influence. While they gradually moved towards embracing development-oriented fields in the curriculum, they often rejected reforms, American instructional reforms, or adapted them to suit their purposes. So then, in conclusion, the Utah families went to Iran with an expectation that they would contribute to the country's modernizations. Their efforts yielded some modest results, but their attempts at reforms, particularly in education, often met significant resistance. The much vaunted faith in American scientific know-how often yielded frustrating and underwhelming results. Advisors learned that the cultural context really did matter, especially when it came to education. And education really gets at the fabric of a nation, of a society's organization. What had worked in the United States, what had worked well in developing the United States, could rarely be translated seamlessly to Iran. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody today for coming and listening, and I hope that wasn't too long or too boring. If there's time for Q&A, are we going to do that here at the end, or?
Well, thank you very much, Ricky, for that informative presentation. And I'm sure there's so much to talk about Utah's involvement that you so accurately portrayed. And so the questions are coming in. I think one of the texts that I got is asking you to talk a little bit more about political development in Iran at that time, and how that impacted individual advisors or group of advisors. The perception, I guess the question is, how did the perception of Iran changed? Before coming to Iran, they had this, you talked about it, they had this perception of the underdeveloped country, but then suddenly they see these political demands for, I guess, Mossadegh's nationalization, all that. How did that impact their perspective of Iran after they returned?
Okay, yeah, good question. I think most of the Utahns generally saw the experience as positive. I think most of them came away with a quite favorable perception of the country and its people. I do think if we want to talk specifically about 1951 and 1953, which is, I think one of the key flashpoints, I do get the sense that the vast majority of the Utahns were not necessarily anti-Mossadegh. I never really got that sense, but I do think they saw, particularly in the large cities, instability from the middle of 1952 to the middle of 1953, and they were relieved when a new government, when after the coup, when Mossadegh was removed from office and the Zahedi government came in, they saw that as a step towards stability. Now, at that time, I don't think they really thought about, or I don't think they really saw this as undermining Iran's sovereignty or undermining the Iranian government's attempt to take control of its own petroleum industry. I don't think they thought in those terms. They thought in terms of stability. They saw mounting instability from 1952 to 1953, and in their view, stability was an important prerequisite for economic development. I also think the Utahns, by and large, put an unwarranted amount of faith in the Shah's leadership. And again, in that regard, they were probably responding to some extent to just the way the U.S. government dealt with Iran backing the Shah's dictatorship, especially after the middle of 1963. The interviews that Jesse Embry do suggest that many of these Utahns did understand that there were human rights abuses in Iran, particularly during the 1970s. I don't think these Utahns exactly understood the full extent of it. But their view of Iran, I think, was generally quite positive coming out of the. And I think by and large, they felt the experience to be quite worthwhile. I think they felt like they did something, or at least they started something that had the potential to be productive. Now, again, a lot of these projects kind of languished with uncertain leadership, especially after the middle of the 1950s. But I think for the most part, their view of the country was quite positive. And the view of the experience was quite positive.
Well, thank you. Matt, we'll go now through some other questions that have showed up on the question and answer. Go ahead, Matt.
We do have some wonderful questions. And I would just kind of make one more point about what was just being discussed, that most of your examples in the PowerPoint were from very dramatic moments in July 1952 and the 30th of Tyr. And if that's kind of a foundational kind of experience for Utah advisors that might not be very familiar with Iran, it really would be, it could be a shock, right? So I really appreciate how you spoke about that and had the imagery kind of to go along with it.
That first group was there in a really interesting time. And, again, I got to say, Richard Welling Roskelly, who led the first Utah State University group, he didn't always seem to be real comfortable in a leadership position. But he was an outstanding observer of and documenter of what was going on. Almost all those photographs are from his photo collection, and the analysis he wrote, which was very much U.S. centric, of you might imagine, but was also quite insightful as well. And so a lot of that comes from his what he saw and what he wrote.
Mm-hmm. Well, we do have some, again, great questions. We could just go through them kind of in sequence here. One is asking about, given the fact that many of the faculty you discussed were associated with the LDS Church, if you could speak to kind of that dynamic between, kind of religious belief and kind of the foreign aid project. And then another one here is asking about, kind of generally what type of background knowledge the Utah State folks would have had kind of on Iran's ancient system of agriculture, which involves kind of all the different factors that you can see there. So maybe those two would be good to start with.
Yeah, they did. Now I don't know how much any of the Utah State people knew about things like Connaughts or those drainage systems, but they all wrote about them. Particularly about the sanitation, and improving the flow of clean water. My guess is that they didn't know much about that before, although that might not exactly be true now that I think about it, because Luther Windsor, who spent a long time in the country, wrote a number of articles that appeared in publications around Utah at about that time. And so I don't know this happened, but it seems possible that Windsor may have served as something of a consultant to these folks, at least giving them a basic sense of what to expect. And again, there were some USU faculty members who had some experience. Pittman, Windsor, Stewart, were all professors at Utah State at one time, and I would imagine they probably provided some insight, but I don't know how extensive it was. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know about Lambden's work. I don't know if that informed them at all or not. There was a lot of research, or a lot of research did come out on Iran's development during the 1950s and 1960s. And again, some of that might have been a little after. The Utah State project ended permanently in 1964. And from 1958 on, it was really just at College. So I don't know if they were familiar with much of that stuff or not. Now, the LDS thing, the LDS connection, I hesitate to say too much. I don't know a great deal about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or how those ideas may have informed. I feel comfortable in saying that they informed the Utahns' experience in a couple of ways. Number one, it gave them a community. It gave them a group that they knew they could rely on. Where they weren't on their own. And I do know that a number of the advisors talked about in the interviews that Jesse Embry did, they did talk about faith sort of sustaining them, religious faith sort of sustaining them. I know at least one or two talked about feeling a little bit of conflict, because some of them had served in religious missions. So they did have this inclination towards proselytizing, which they, was forbidden under the U.S. contracts. And I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the name escapes me, but one of the Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture was an LDS guy. Oh God, what is his name? I can't remember his name. But anyway, he helped in the organizing of some of these projects, and he told the advisors, look, Benson, that's right, Benson. Richard Saunders just told me, Benson was Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture. And he told those advisors, he said, look, you're not going to be able to do any religious proselytizing. You know, that the US government forbids that, the Iranian government forbids that. But you can live your faith. I mean, you can go over there and live the way you believe. And I think the Utahns really felt like that helped them establish working relationships with a lot of Iranian leaders, especially as the US government sort of had a problem, not just in Iran, but around the world in the Cold War, of diplomats behaving badly, you know, and contractors being sort of aloof from the population. And I don't know that the Utahns they didn't really live that way. They wouldn't really behave that way. They didn't have a lot of drinking parties. You know, they didn't do a lot of carousing. They weren't really careerists. You know, they didn't really see Iran as just the next step towards building their career. And I do think that had some impact on the way Iranians responded to them.
Perhaps we can take another pair of questions to keep moving through here. I think these two might go well together, one from the Q&A and one from the chat. In the Q&A, we have a question about kind of how the aid missions were divided, what the kind of sub-entities were, and what types of other universities might have been involved in kind of Iran outside of the Utah schools.
Yeah.
And in the chat, we have a question about kind of the potential, you know, future influence or legacies of the Utah programs, for instance, with regard to Peace Corps. So there's a question about the impact on work in the 60s and 70s in relation to Peace Corps volunteers and any potential connections.
Okay, so that first question there on other universities involved, you are absolutely right. There was the Syracuse University Multimedia group did cooperate with, especially with the Utah State folks, and when they had these fairs, these little local fairs to demonstrate techniques. The Syracuse folks would often be involved in developing the brochures and the publicity and even making little films, little informational films about that. So the Syracuse folks were absolutely involved. The other U.S. university that I'm familiar with in Iran was the University of Pennsylvania group that went to what was then called Pahlavi University. I think today it's Shiraz University. In the 1960s to kind of build or kind of try to develop this, comprehensive research university like public universities in the United States are moving towards. The Penn Pahlavi project was quite problematic. The Penn group and some of the Pahlavi University leaders had some difficulties in getting along with one another, and but those were two that I'm aware of. Two other universities. The Penn one was a little later. I think the Penn one, if I remember correctly, went from like 1962 to 1967 or something like that. Now, Matt, what other one did you mentioned one about legacies and like the Peace Corps and things like that?
In the chat, we have the question as opposed to in the Q&A.
Okay. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay. So, I didn't really realize this, but Utah State actually did. Well, I wrote a little bit about this towards the end, but it was kind of terse. Utah State did continue agricultural contacts in Iran up until 1978, and the reason why they terminated during the Islamic Revolution in 1979 really wasn't necessarily that they were kicked out. It was that there were legal battles over who would control the money. But you're right. The Peace Corps, Utah State did help in training Peace Corps volunteers. I learned that recently through the Baskerville talk. I don't. Let's see. Especially for Peace Corps volunteers. The Utah folks continued. They developed an institute in the 70s that worked on sheep and goat development. And they actually had some other projects planned in the middle of the in the latter part of the 1970s, it started to get more and more difficult to find people who would go into Iran. There was starting to be more unrest in that country. I don't know exactly what the specific connection between the Peace Corps and the .4 programs were, other than I know that Utah State was later involved in helping the training programs for Peace Corps. I don't know it says this question came from James Good. I don't know, Jim, you were there. I mean, you were kind of on the ground. Do you have anything to add into that, or can participants not? Can they actually speak in this?
Yeah, we can make them.
Okay, let's see.
I also I think here it is. Jim?
Am I muted? No.
Yeah,
Oh, you're
go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. No, I don't know a lot about agricultural work for the Peace Corps. I mean, I was not one of the agricultural workers, but there were a number of programs. And there were lots of, over the years, 62 to 76, there were a lot of Peace Corps volunteers who served out in the field agricultural training. I mentioned in my memoir one experience of a friend of mine who was in a neighboring small town, and he was working really very much at the local level. But then I think in the late 60s, early 70s, big American agricultural concerns began to come in and develop, with support from the Iranian government, to develop agribusiness in Khuzestan, in the southwest of the country, raising cotton and other industrial crops and so forth. And I think this displaced a lot of Iranian agricultural workers and farmers, and they ended up flooding into the cities and so forth. But it seemed to be very, much opposed to the kind of work that you talk about, Richard, with these small groups trying to do local one-on-one or, in small groups rather than large infrastructural programs and so forth. But I just didn't know what kind of, whether the Peace Corps, when they trained the agricultural workers, whether what they learned from the Utahns, and particularly as there were Peace Corps groups that were being trained in Utah at these universities, I wonder what kind of carry-on there was from one to the other. I don't know the answer.
I don't exactly know. That's a really good follow-up question. And then that would be something maybe that would be a good question to look into for a follow-up project. I had originally hoped to do something on the legacies, especially for Utah State University. Because Utah State University, for a kind of a mid-sized public university, USU remained remarkably engaged in the world of international development throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And a lot of these folks that got their start in international development in Iran continued to contribute. So I would imagine there was some connection. I didn't do as much as I wanted to because I was kind of under the pressure to get the manuscript done. But I do know, to just kind of piggyback real quickly on something that Jim said, it is interesting that when the White Revolution kind of the big 62 plan, 7-year plan kind of kicked in, and the much bigger development projects, Point Four was pretty marginalized in that. And from what I understand, the research into Iran's agricultural development in the 1960s suggests that a lot of those land reform programs and the White Revolution actually ended up having a pretty negative impact on small and medium-sized Iranian farmers. As these projects got larger and larger and more grandiose, got away from community level development, they don't seem to have been as effective. And in some cases, in the middle of the 1960s, they actually seem to have worked against small and medium-sized farmers. There was a lot of dislocation in the rural communities. And again, Point Four had largely been marginalized in that. They'd kind of moved away from that vision. Somebody had asked here about the photograph collections and if they're available for viewing online. They are not, as far as I know, but I made scans of quite a few things when I was in Utah. So they're not great quality, but I have scans of quite a few things from the Richard Welling Ross Kelly photograph collection, which is an enormous photograph collection. The Luther Windsor collection, a lot of those photos are really cool. In fact, I can show you some of them actually. These are older photos and they're kind of a little bit beat up, but find them here.
While you're looking for the photo, Ricky, I thought another important connection of Utah State was that Iranian ambassador to Washington, Zahedi, was a graduate of Utah State, and he was very sympathetic to exchanges. So he facilitated the visas, the transfers. So in many ways, I think another good way of looking at the connection of Utah State is how they really collected their alumni group. The Iranian alumni group that went to Utah State, that later became really engaged in helping Utah State's international development. I think that's another area that really Utah State has done a great job of looking at their alumni group and see how they could benefit their international development programs.
Okay, is there a way, do you guys have a way that I could take over the screen share?
Yes, just a minute.
If you do, I'll show you some of these photographs from the Luther Windsor collection.
You have the.
Okay, yep, I got it. I got it. Okay, here you go. Okay, so these are photographs from Luther Windsor's traveling around Iran in 1941 to 1946. And again, you see a lot of these deal with certain aspects of farming and commerce. He was also involved quite a bit in commerce. So you've got, and I don't know if I can make this any bigger. Are these a good size for people? Can people see? They're not very big photographs to begin with, but here's a camels.
Wow, look at that.
Here the water. Yeah, I think somebody in the chat had asked about these. How do you pronounce? Were those like jubes or how do you pronounce that? Jubes, the water, the canal. Yeah, the canals that brought water in and out. And of course, one of the big things, how to improve the sanitation and the water quality of those. Actually, some of the Utah families actually use these water distribution services. Of course, here's Persepolis. There's one of the Shaw there that I used. Again, the carpets. But anyway, these are just some of the photos from the Luther Windsor collection. Let me see. Okay. Again, here's some ancient some monuments from Achaemenid period. But yeah, I mean, now Windsor was kind of an interesting guy. Now this guy was a Cold Wars guy. I mean, everything was the Ruskies and the commies with Luther Windsor. So you got to kind of read between the lines on what he had to say with the, and of course, this is Utah. A lot of these folks were just sort of generally politically conservative, in their Cold War outlook, so you do have to kind of read around some of Luther Windsor's rhetoric, but it's clear that he had learned quite a bit about the country and about its agricultural concerns and agricultural development. See if there's any more of these. Here's a couple that I had used on the. So anyway, those are the Windsor ones, and so I'll take this off now. And but anyway, I do have, so to get back to that question originally about the foes being available, I'm happy to share anything I have. If you send me an email to rgarlitz@utm.edu. Let's see, what else do we have?
Ricky, there are two good questions that I think relate
ahead.
to each other here about, kind of Iranian, Iranians in Utah. So folks who might have studied at some of the Utah schools and either remained in the United States or returned to Iran. And then there's a question about, the kind of friends and contacts of the Utah advisors in Iran, especially in the Iranian bureaucracy, folks who might have had specific interests in agricultural development. So could we think about Iranians that came to Utah and then Iranians who were friends of Utah in Iran, just those two questions together?
Well, probably Ambassador Zahidi's, the prime minister's son, would probably be the most famous. He graduated from Utah State University and worked on the .4 payroll. I guess there was some controversy of whether or not he should really be working on .4. I think at one point the Prime Minister Mossadegh said, "Hey, you guys got to get rid of this guy. He's a problem for me." But he was involved in technical assistance. Let's see. There are probably others. If I could think on that one for a little bit, I might be able to come up with a more thorough response. Let me see. Let me see if I can come back to that one on other Iranians who worked with the program. What was the other one, Matt, that you had referenced?
Well, there are a few questions that relate to Iranians who were brought to Utah under U.S. government programs in the period, or even Iranian students currently who might be enrolled in similar programs. So the last two in the Q&A I think relate to each other. I don't know if you have anything to say.
Oh, okay, here, I'm sorry, I was looking at the chat.
Yeah, I think there are several Iranian students in doctoral programs focusing on water research at Utah State right now. And I think also a couple of years ago, Utah State and Iranian University of Urumqi started a joint project on the study of Lake Urumqi. So as Ricky mentioned, these connections of Utah State people keeps going. And so if I think it's between the Watershed Studies Department and University of Urumqi, they're doing some research on the Lake Urumqi and why the water is being reduced and so forth. So as Ricky mentioned, there is this kind of a chemistry between Utah State and development inside Iran.
Yeah, I don't actually, to get to the question by Daniel Adams, I don't actually know if there are Iranian students in Utah or not. Now, I do know, as James Good pointed out in his, there was the .4 program and its successor programs in the 60s did have what they called these participant training grants. And lots of Utahns came to the United States through the participant training program. In fact, some of them actually a guy who wrote one of the really influential books on the oil nationalization crisis. I think the last name was Elm. Mustafa might have been the first name. Was one of those. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That was one who went to the University of Southern California. I should have mentioned this in the question about other universities. USC also was involved in building a college of business and government affairs, public administration at University of Tehran, and that group included a number of people who became government, who were involved in government leadership in Iran. But some did come to Utah State as well in the 1950s and 60s. I don't know that as many came to BYU or the University of Utah. And the University of Utah has a big Middle East Studies program. And as far as I know, I don't know that there's any real direct connection between that Middle East Studies program and University of Utah and these these Iran projects. From what I understand, that Middle East Studies program was developed by just a couple of faculty members, and I don't know if there's any direct connection. But James Good is correct. There were Iranians who came to Utah, and I'd have to go back and dig around in the records a little bit to find out what I don't remember right off the top of my head what they ended up doing. But I know several did get advanced degrees.
Well, we have time for one more question, and so let's look at there was, I think you mentioned that the Utah program, no, I'm sorry, you mentioned the 0.4 on irrigation, but Utah was a major developer of dryland farming.
No, yeah, that is, I think, actually, Richard, you're correct. Richard Saunders, you're correct. And not only was it a factor, I think it was part of the reason why the Utah folks, the Utah colleges were chosen, because of the soil and climate similarities in Utah to Iran. I think that's one of the major reasons why Utah State University was chosen. So yes, I do. It's my understanding that was indeed a factor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll try it. Let me see that this question from a Robert Bell on key players in the Iranian bureaucracy. Well, let me see if I can I send Bahman, can I send you an answer to that?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
In the next few days? Let me dig around a little bit on that one.
Well, I thank you so much. I want to really thank everybody and Ricky for this really good presentation. It's not something that we could be over so many areas that we need to look at, but I'm really glad that we brought the Utah connections here, because on its own is an important connection to Iran that distinguishes the state and the research you have done. I highly recommend Ricky's book, definitely to read more about it, and his description of some of the Utahns like Ross Kelly, and wonderful diary that he kept. I think he's a sociologist, right? He was a rural sociologist. So
he was Richard Saunders' grandfather. So do we have that right, Richard? Was it rural sociology, right? Was his major field? And Ross Kelly was another one of these guys who worked in development programs at Utah State well after the 0.4 thing in the 50s.
Yeah. So I think his materials is really worth looking at. Well, so I want to thank Ricky for this presentation. Thank you all for joining us for another event, and please join us again in April when we have Persis Karim from San Francisco State University, who's going to talk about the Iranian identity and what does it mean to be Iranian today. So thank you very much. Delara will put the recording up and send a link to the recording to everybody. And if Ricky can provide those information, we'll also include those into the chat room of the recording.
And I don't know if Professor Quinn is logged off or not, but if you're still around, Shola, thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it.
Yes, she was logged in. Okay, thank you so much, and please join us for our next webinar. Thank you so much, Rich.
Thank you.
Thank you.